What's up, readers? I'm Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and I wanted to grab a little bit of time here to review with all of you the books that I read this past fall, run through them really quickly, see how quickly I can do this, but still give you my thoughts on them so that hopefully you find something in there that was of interest to you, and that you might pick up if your reading tastes run along the same veins as mine. So without further ado, let's jump into it, and as usual, I'm going to break these down into categories, starting with nonfiction. And in the last season, so for the last few months, the nonfiction that I've been reading has all been focused around how to read literature. Obviously, if I'm reading this much on how to read literature, it's because I'm working on a video, hopefully for all of you, that you will find interesting and fun. And in the last few months, I've read 3 books: How to Read Literature Like a Professor by, I believe it's John C. Foster. I'll put all of the names of all these books down in the description below, so even if I get a name wrong, don't worry about it. How to Read Literature by Terry Eagleton, and How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. So let me tackle these each one by one, because even though they all deal with the same subject matter, I do want to give you guys a few notes on each in case this is a topic that interests you and you do want to pick one up. And if this is not something that interests you, well, jump ahead using the chapters in the video below to get to a part of the video that is a little bit more interesting to you. And I'm going to start with How to Read Literature by Terry Eagleton. So this book is a relatively quick read, broken into 4 or 5 sections. By the way, I don't have a lot of these books with me because there's a ton of them that I took out from the library, some of them which I read as ebooks. And so rather than me just holding up a couple books, you're just going to see me flash the picture of the book on the screen. So How to Read Literature by Terry Eagleton. This is one of those books where it's one of those few times where I really am happy that I decided to read all the way to the end, because this book is a book that overall I don't feel like I got a ton out of. I felt like Eagleton was spending a lot of time talking about literature at sort of a very high level. There wasn't a whole lot that was practical, that was tangible in this book, as compared to one of the next books that I'm going to mention in a second here. But I'm still really happy I read it to the end, because this is one of those few times where by the end of the book, I was able to pull out one single little nugget, and that little nugget is something that is going to stick with me for a long time. And essentially, that nugget is a quote from Eagleton, which is the following: "You can enjoy books you do not admire and admire books you do not enjoy." And I think this quote really sums up a lot of the arguments that I have seen pop up whenever people are discussing literature and people start discussing their favorite books, especially in sort of the circles that I run in, where I tend to do a big cross-section of sort of classics and literary fiction and more popular fiction like fantasy and stuff like that. And my favorites tend to cut across all these genres. And what I'll often see is that people will confuse admiration with enjoyment and say that, you know, a book that they particularly admire is something that should therefore be classed in one of the best books of all time, whereas a book that one just enjoys shouldn't be put amongst your favorites because it's simple enjoyment and not admiration. And so this quote by Terry Eagleton, "You can enjoy books you do not admire and admire books you do not enjoy," I think sums up perfectly the way that we should look at different types of art. There's art that is there to be admired, and there's art that is there to be enjoyed. And sometimes those two things do not go hand in hand. When they do go hand in hand, well, that is when we really find something special. Beyond that, I'm not sure this is a book that I could particularly recommend to anyone, even someone who's looking to read more on this topic. The next book that I want to talk about, though, I do think is a fantastic read for readers of all levels, because it is a great introduction to how to approach maybe more difficult literature. So How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Don't let the title fool you. Really, this book is something that is really accessible. The author's tone and the author's voice, he uses a lot of humor, and so it's really a book that anyone can pick up, and it'll allow you to get a little bit deeper into some of the literature that you are reading. The biggest criticism of this book that I've heard is that it is not advanced enough, and so that the author really focused more on sort of introduction to reading literature as opposed to sort of professor level reading of literature, which in theory means that you are studying this at a PhD level. The reality is you're not going to write a popular book about how to read literature like a PhD, because people who are reading literature like a PhD have academic papers that they're going to be reading about this stuff. And they're not going to get a whole lot out of a how-to book that's published for a mass audience. And so I think the title really is just more of a sort of tongue-in-cheek way of saying how to get a little bit more out of what you're reading, and really shouldn't be taken as kind of a, if you read this book, then you'll be able to read like a English lit professor. And frankly, I think for most of us, we don't want to read like English lit professors unless you have very scholarly, very academic pursuits. Most of us are out here, we're reading because we enjoy it. And maybe we want to get a little bit more out of our reading. We want to understand some of the nuances that maybe go over our heads. How to read literature like a professor is fantastic for that. I think if you go any deeper than that, you're kind of getting into the weeds. Which brings me to the third book in my How to Read journey for the past season or so, and that is How to Read and Why by Harold Bloom. So I've talked a lot about Harold Bloom in past videos, specifically my video about what makes a reader. And in that video, I was pretty critical of Bloom's stance on what makes a reader and what is truly considered reading and what he thinks of as junk. Bloom is probably the type of writer that those people who had criticisms of the previous book that I was talking about, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, this is probably the book that they wanted to read. Bloom takes a much more sort of academic, a much more fine-tooth approach to analyzing literature. However, How to Read and Why is a very strange book, because when you pick up the book, you assume that it's going to be a book about how to read generally, but that's not what it is at all. In fact, what it is a series of Bloom's thoughts on how to read specific pieces in different genres. So he talks about how to read specific novels, how to read specific short stories, how to read specific poems, specific dramas and plays, and he goes into sort of his favorites, right? So he doesn't give you sort of a general view of how you should approach reading, or even a general view of why you should approach reading, even though he does make sort of passing allusion to it. Also, Bloom really has a beautiful writing style, and it's sort of one of those things that you can kind of get swept up in. But it is not a style that, at least in my opinion, is particularly useful if you're going to use a book as sort of a pedagogical tool to learn how to do something, whether that is learn how to analyze a text or learn how to kind of get more out of the literature you're looking for. If you want to learn how to read one of the books that Bloom talks about in his in this book, like if you want to learn how to read Moby Dick, or if you want to learn how to read Beloved by Toni Morrison, or one of the other novels, short stories, or plays that Bloom talks about, if you want to sort of get an overview of how to read Hamlet, for example, you can pick this book up, read the chapter on that work, and it'll give you a nice sort of introduction, nice sort of lesson. But it is not something that I would say is required reading. The next category I'll talk about is modern literary fiction, and only one book to talk about in this category this time around, and that is Killing Commendatore by Haruki Murakami. So again, those of you who followed me for a while know that I am a Haruki Murakami fan. I believe at this point I've read all of his novels, most of his nonfiction, and most of his short story collections. So I definitely one of the authors whose body of works I have consumed the most of. Now, Killing Commendatore, the last book of his that I had not yet read, which I just recently read, what I will say about this book is, if you are a Murakami fan, I think you will love Killing Commendatore. If you are not a Murakami fan, I don't think this is going to be the book that converts you. In fact, I think if you are not a Murakami fan, I think you'll actually hate this book. It is by no means a perfect book, and it is nowhere near my favorite Murakami book. I still have a soft spot for Murakami's earlier work. Killing Commendatore suffers from some of the same challenges some of his more recent books have had. For one, I think it's a little bit too long. There's stuff in there that did not need to be in this book. So Killing Commendatore is somewhere north of 700 pages long. And you really have to ask yourself once you get to the end of the book, did it really need to be this long? The themes and the ideas and the way they're explored, I think, are phenomenal. I think, as always, Murakami is one of those authors who can make me feel this weird sort of balance between what is real and what is not real, and find that kind of in-between space. But again, I think that if you had taken this 700-something page novel, condensed it down to maybe 450 pages, I think you would have not lost any of the themes that you're exploring about sort of using art to explore the world and kind of loss and finding our place in the world. I think Murakami could have still explored all those themes, still attached his signature style to it. It just would have been a little bit more condensed, a little bit more satisfying in that it wouldn't have felt like this is going on for a while. Now, that being said, again, as a Murakami fan who loves to read his style and who could just read Murakami all day, every day, for me, to some extent, having 700 pages of Murakami to read is great because there's more for me to read. But if you're not in love with Murakami's style, I definitely would steer clear of Killing Commendatore. Shifting gears a little bit, I read one graphic novel this fall, and it was The Fade Out by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. This is my introduction to the Brubaker-Phillips team up of author and artist, and from my understanding, they've done a bunch of books together. This, I don't believe, is the most recent, nor do I believe it's one of the oldest, but The Fade Out is essentially a noir-styled graphic novel set in sort of 50s era Hollywood. If you are at all a fan of James Ellroy's writing, especially earlier Ellroy, the LA Quartet, which I'm a huge fan of, as people who've watched my stuff know, if you're an Ellroy fan, I think you will love The Fade Out. It's got that same sort of grittiness, that same sort of feel. You can sort of really, you really feel as though you're living in 50s Hollywood. The plot of this has just enough twists and turns to keep you guessing. The characters are flawed and gritty as they should be in a noir style story, and the graphic novel medium is used really well here. And you really have that great balance of kind of really clean art that doesn't get in the way of the story, but also Phillips is really good at adding intensity and emotion into a scene that kind of elevates Brubaker's writing. So I think this was a really, really great graphic novel. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's a fan of sort of, like I said, 50s noir style stories, whether they be literary or graphic in nature. I still think this is either way a good pickup for you. Shifting gears again, let's talk about the classics now. I'm going to talk about 3 or 5 classics, depending on how you kind of want to split this up. Maybe 6, I don't know. All right, we'll just jump into it. Starting off with Aesop's Fables. So Aesop's Fables, everyone I think is aware of Aesop's Fables. So they're fables like The Tortoise and the Hare being probably the most famous. But there's dozens and dozens of fables. I got this really great illustrated edition that is kind of this, family keepsake edition, really nice slipcover, beautiful art. I bought this because I wanted to hand it down to my kids, and so we read through this, my son and I, my son who's just turned 5, we read through this in, I think, one night, maybe 2 nights, and he really enjoyed the stories, and he kind of, I don't know if he's old enough to really grasp some of the morals and the lessons that come out of these fables, but it was an enjoyable experience for us. For me, these are stories that I remember from my youth, and I was able to pass them down to my son, and that was really fun. And if nothing else, he learned what a jackdaw was, which, let's be honest, how many people have you met in their day-to-day who don't know what a jackdaw is? Moving on. So the next piece of classic literature that I read was really 3 pieces in one, and it was the Theban Plays by Sophocles. So the Theban Plays are 3 plays written by Sophocles, which are sometimes referred to as a trilogy or a cycle, but they really shouldn't be, because a trilogy or a cycle implies that the story continues throughout, whereas these were really meant as 3 different tellings of stories from sort of Greek myth. And so those 3 plays, in the order in which they were written, are Antigone, which is actually the one that happens the latest chronologically, but was written first. Then there's Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, which is probably the most famous play by Sophocles. And then lastly, Oedipus at Colonna, which was the final play that was written by Sophocles and was actually performed after his death. But again, if you were to try and follow this chronologically, because really we're following the same set of characters, chronologically it would be Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonna, and then Antigone being Oedipus's daughter. By the way, I don't know if it's Oedipus or Oedipus. I say Oedipus. I've heard other people say Oedipus. Maybe I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know down in the comments below. So this was my first time reading these plays. Obviously, I was familiar with the mythology. I knew who Sophocles was. So Sophocles, for those who don't know, one of probably the most famous playwrights, I don't think you would call them playwrights, but famous dramatists of ancient Greece, was alive during sort of the Periclean age of ancient Athens. So kind of really at the height of Athens' power. One of the most popular dramatists, like I said. He wrote something like over 100 plays. There are 7, I believe, which are still have still come down to us today. 3 of them being the 3 that I just mentioned. So Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonna, and Antigone. One of the things that I find interesting is as you read through Sophocles, it really reads in a way like you could be reading Shakespeare when you're reading Sophocles. That, there's debate as to whether or not Shakespeare ever read Sophocles. Most people agree that he never would have, because there was no Latin translation of Sophocles available, and most people think Shakespeare couldn't read ancient Greek, and therefore he never actually read Sophocles, and so he couldn't have been influenced by Sophocles. But that argument kind of misses the point that Sophocles obviously influenced later dramatists, whether they be in sort of the Roman era and thereafter, and those people obviously definitely had an impact on Chaucer and then Shakespeare. And so regardless of whether Shakespeare read these plays or not, you can read through this and you can kind of get the same sort of feeling that you get when you are reading Shakespearean plays. And obviously Shakespeare has had an enormous impact on modern literature, and that kind of goes without saying. So when you kind of read the stuff that had an impact on the stuff that is having an impact on the stuff that you're reading today, it gives you a feeling of where all this stuff comes from. And the kind of like when I read the Epic of Gilgamesh a few months ago, the thing that really strikes me is that the themes that you're exploring here really are themes that are universal, despite the fact that this stuff was written, in the case of Sophocles, we're talking 2,500 years ago. This was written and performed, but the themes that are being explored are really things that are still relevant today. And so in a lot of ways, you can read this as a very modern play, and it's also very, very readable. So the Fagles translation, which is the one that I read, is not a difficult read at all, and it's super accessible. And if nothing else, even if you don't appreciate sort of the history of where this play comes from, the plays themselves are just really good reads. And so if you read Oedipus Rex, for example, and you kind of think of the story behind the story of Oedipus and how he got a prophecy that he would kill his father and mother, and so he runs away to another place where he accidentally ends up killing the king and then marrying his wife, not knowing that this is actually his real mother and father, and therefore accidentally making the prophecy come true. And all of this is started because his father and his mother were originally given a prophecy that their son would kill them. You put all this together and you're like, this is a really intricate, interesting plot with a lot of twists, and the story itself is just really, really entertaining. And so put aside the fact that this is 2,500 years old, put aside the fact that this has implications for the future of literature, and just read it for the story that it is. And these are really, really great plays. And I have zero regrets of having read those three Theban plays, which I think anyone who is a fan of literature should definitely go back and read those early classics, because it gives you an idea of where these things come from. And at the same time, they're also just plain fun. And sticking with the theme of ancient Greece here, but going way more modern, I accidentally stumbled upon a trio of books by Stephen Fry. So hopefully you know who Stephen Fry is. I'm a big fan, maybe you're not, but that doesn't really matter for the purposes of this conversation. But Stephen Fry wrote 3 books entitled Mythos, Heroes, and Troy, which are his sort of great Greek mythology trilogy or whatever. Again, it's not really a trilogy because the story doesn't flow amongst all three. But the first of these books is Mythos, which is a book about sort of the classic Greek myths, retold in a sort of very modern way by Stephen Fry. I did not actually read Mythos because I didn't get my hands on it. I actually picked up Troy, which is the third book in the series first, and then sort of worked my way backwards and read Heroes, which is the second book in the trilogy thereafter. So Troy and Heroes are the two books that I read. Both of them are fantastic. I preferred Troy a little bit more because it's sort of one long narrative. And having just read the Iliad not long ago, reading Stephen Fry's retelling of that story and then the additional sort of context before and after the story of the Iliad was really, really great. So Stephen Fry's approach to doing this is essentially, I think what he's trying to do is he's essentially just trying to take the greatest stories from ancient Greece and retelling them in a way that makes them more accessible to modern audiences using sort of his trademark wit and intelligence. And so you read through these stories and they're just really, really fun. And you understand kind of where these things are coming from. And as he goes, Stephen Fry also goes out of his way to point out kind of how these myths have impacted things that we do today. And it's hilarious because after every sort of individual story that he talks about, or every individual person or character he mentions, he goes on to talk about how this person or character has essentially gone on to give their name to something that exists in our modern day world today. And the number of examples that you get across these books is just absolutely astounding. But again, similarly to what I was saying about the Theban plays, even more so in the case of these modern retellings, the reason that you should be reading these books by Stephen Fry is because they're just a whole lot of fun. They're great stories. Stephen Fry does a great job of telling them in a really engaging, entertaining way. And they're part of our common shared history, our common shared culture, especially in the Western world. And so having a knowledge of these ancient myths and understanding how they have come to impact the world that we live in today, I think is just great general knowledge for everyone. And doing it in such a way that it's a lot of fun. You know, I can't get over how much I enjoyed these books, and I wouldn't be surprised if when I do my top 10 of 2023, you see one of these books in that top 10. That's my prediction right now. The last category that I'm going to go through, but probably the largest, is fantasy books, of which I read quite a few in the last season, so in the fall season. I do need to point out that in the case of fantasy books, some of these books I read, but some of these books I've also listened to as audiobooks, and so that is one of the reasons why the quantity of fantasy I consume tends to be so much higher than other types of books, because when it comes to literature or classics, those I tend to read, whereas fantasy I'll either read or listen to an audiobook. And so that is why, volume-wise, it seems like I read a lot more fantasy, when in fact, page for page, it's probably not that skewed. So that being said, getting that out of the way, let's go through the fantasy books that I read in the fall, starting with Mort by Terry Pratchett. So this is part of my ongoing quest, call it a quest if you will, to read all of the Discworld novels from the very first one, The Color of Magic, all the way to the very last Discworld novel which was published, which I don't actually know what that is. So once I get there, I'll share that with you. So I've read a bunch of the Discworld novels in the past, but now I'm going back and I'm rereading them all in order of publication. Mort is the fourth book in the series out of I think it's like 40 books, maybe a little bit less if you don't count the children's books. But so Mort is number 4, and it is the book that is known and beloved because it introduces a character in the Discworld series, the character of Death, which many people think of as one of their favorite Terry Pratchett characters of all time, and it is hard to disagree with this. Death is just such a great character. Obviously, you can't talk about a Pratchett novel without talking about how funny it is, and Death, which does not seem like the type of subject or the type of character which you could make funny. Pratchett manages to do it in a way that isn't quite absurd, and still gives Death a certain amount of gravitas, and yet still so funny. Every time Death is on the page, he sort of steals the scene that he's in. This book is not ostensibly about Death, it's about Mort, who is Death's apprentice, which already right there, premise of the book is Death gets an apprentice, and so this is a young boy who is Death's apprentice. Hijinks ensue. It's just it's a funny romp, but over the course of it, as Terry Pratchett tends to do, he makes you stop and think about certain things. And so, asking questions like, what is life really if there is no death? If you can't die, is there any real meaning to life? So these are things that you are going to think about as you read this book, but mostly you're just going to sit back, enjoy, and laugh at this story. By the way, quick thing that I only realized about halfway through, and I'm kind of ashamed of myself for not having realized this earlier, but Mort, the main character's name, Mort in French, mort, means dead. And so that's just a nice little play on words, which I don't know how it took me half the book to realize that was happening. But hats off to you, Sir Terry Pratchett. Another excellent book, which I'll talk about maybe a little bit more in a future video. Next up is Deadhouse Gates, so that's book 2 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson. I did an entire reading vlog on Deadhouse Gates, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it in this video, but suffice it to say that I liked Deadhouse Gates even more than I liked Gardens of the Moon, which is saying something because I absolutely gushed over Gardens of the Moon when I read it. I thought Deadhouse Gates was a phenomenal novel. I think Erikson is probably one of the best living, working fantasy writers we have today. I think his writing style is phenomenal. I think in Deadhouse Gates, his character work got better. I think his pacing got better. Thematically, he's always been great at sort of drawing a theme throughout all of his stories, and so that part is still solid. The one criticism I had for Deadhouse Gates, which I said in my vlog video, was I had an issue with the ending, and I realized after posting that video the challenge in posting spoiler-free videos is that people thought that when I said that, I was referring to the entire ending of the book, which is actually not true. The ending, so there's multiple different plot lines in this book, and I was more than happy with most of them, but there is one specific plot line that left me feeling just kind of cold and disappointed. If you've read the book, try and guess which one I'm talking about by dropping me a comment in the comment below. But a lot of people took issue with me saying that the ending of that book wasn't great, when in fact most of the plot lines are wrapped up in such a way that's really, really powerful. And I think it is some of the best writing in fantasy that I've ever read. And I know that that's saying a lot because most people don't even put Deadhouse Gates in their top 3 Malazan books of all time. So I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the series. Next up, I'm lumping a whole bunch of books together here, and it is the Dresden Files series of books, which I recently just started reading / listening to on audiobook. And in the last 3 months, I read and or listened to the first 7 books in the series. So going up to, I believe that brings us up to Deadbeat is the 7th book in the series. And so I just recently started getting into the Dresden Files. It was one of those fantasy series that a lot of people say is one of the better fantasy series. Obviously, this is an urban fantasy series. Harry Dresden is a wizard that lives in Chicago, and he advertises in the Yellow Pages. Obviously, the first book was written in 2000, and so advertising in the Yellow Pages was still a thing. In 2023, you wouldn't really advertise in the Yellow Pages. I guess you'd be listed on Google. Anyway, it is, so my thoughts on the first 7 Dresden Files books. So obviously, if I made it through the first 7, I obviously don't hate this series, otherwise I would not have kept going. There are parts of the Dresden Files series that I'm not crazy about. Harry's character, I kind of vacillate on Harry's character specifically, and this is a tough one because the Dresden Files are a first-person narrative, and so Harry's the one who narrates all of his books, and so you spend a lot of time in Harry's head. My issue is that I don't really like Harry's head. Some of Harry's thoughts, frankly, are a little bit tough to wrap your head around, and some of this I know is Jim Butcher, the author, doing this on purpose, trying to give you a sense of who he is and kind of how he's come to be this type of person, this type of character. And you're not going to agree with everything he thinks, and he's not a perfect white knight kind of character. He's flawed. So obviously this is all part of the story, and this is all done on purpose. That being said, there is a lot of other things going on in the Dresden Files which are good enough that kept me reading and or listening to the books. And so I will say one thing. If it weren't for audiobooks, I'm not entirely sure I would have read through the first 7 Dresden File books. But because this is the kind of thing where the books are relatively short, you can pop them in, listen to them while you're doing something else. It doesn't require a ton of brain power. These are not particularly deep books, but they are fun. They're kind of like murder mystery for the fantasy geek crowd, and especially the first 3 or 4 books. And then after that, as pretty much anyone who is a fan of the Dresden Files will tell you, as of book 4 or so, the series really starts to go in a little bit more of a broader direction. You get kind of a more overarching story. The world opens up, there's more world building. It starts to feel a little bit more like the modern fantasy that more call it serious fantasy readers are used to. So here's my thinking on the Dresden Files. If you read the first book and you absolutely detest it, stop. Is it going to get better as the series progresses? Yes, but it is not going to be enough to get you from going from I hate this to I love it. If you find yourself on the fence, but you feel like maybe there's an opportunity that this could go somewhere, then I would definitely stick it out for a few more books. If you still feel that way after, call it the 4th or 5th book, then throw in the towel, okay? Because there is sort of a tipping point. The other slight thing I want to mention, because I've never heard anyone else mention this before, but specifically when I'm talking about the audiobooks here, the earlier audiobooks, so all the audiobooks in the Dresden Files series are narrated by James Marsters, so people in the geek crowd will know that name from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and there's a whole, from what I understand, there's a whole contingent of fans who got into the Dresden Files simply because of James Marsters narrating the series. I like James Marsters, but I'm not crazy about him as a narrator. I think he's fine. I don't think he is the greatest narrator ever. I think if you've got people like Michael Kramer or Kate Rating who narrate Brandon Sanderson's books or Robert Jordan's books, I think they're phenomenal. Guys like Stephen Pacey, also excellent, who does Joe Abercrombie's books. I don't think James Marsters is there, but I also don't think he's bad by any means. I think he's a very decent narrator. However, the reason I'm going off on this tangent, I'm talking about audiobook narrators, is the first few books in the Dresden Files, I don't know if it's because they were recorded at a time where the series wasn't that popular and there was a lower budget, but the quality of audio editing on those books is not fantastic. And you'll notice a significant difference if you listen to one of the first few books and you compare it to one of the later books in terms of the quality of the audio, not just because Marsters becomes a better narrator, which I do believe he does, but in the editing quality, you'll hear a noticeable difference. Things like they will not edit out lip smacking noises, for example, or there's sibilance, which is that sound you hear a lot when someone's speaking too close to a microphone, or popping sounds when you get a P or a T sound when someone is narrating. Those are not edited out in a quality that you would expect in sort of a top tier audiobook. And that to me, in the first few books, maybe because I've gotten a little bit spoiled with some of the higher quality audiobooks that have come out in the last few years, but some of those earlier books were actually hard for me to listen to because of some of those audio quality issues. So something to keep in mind. Maybe you want to actually read those first few books on paper before switching over to audio. Just food for thought. And lastly, the last book that I'm going to mention here is Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. So this is the second standalone book in the First Law world by Joe Abercrombie. So the First Law world includes the First Law trilogy, which were the first 3 books that were written in that world. And then there were 3 standalone books, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and then I believe it's Red Country is the 3rd book. And then you have another trilogy, which comes after that. And that's sort of the First Law world as it exists today, with more to come, I'm sure, because Joe Abercrombie is not only a phenomenal writer, but writes about as, aside from Brandon Sanderson, probably one of the most consistent fantasy writers out there in terms of pumping out quality work. So back to The Heroes. So The Heroes is the second standalone book in the 3 standalone sort of books in the First Law world. It's interesting because when I think standalone, I think about a story that can be read sort of on its own at any point in time. You don't need to have read something first or have read something after. And while the story to The Heroes is entirely self-contained, it is interesting to me that a lot of the backstory of what happens in The Heroes actually happens in Best Served Cold, which is another standalone. So even though we talk about Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country as being 3 standalone books, really you could almost think of them as yet another trilogy. So it's interesting to me that that they're really thought of as standalones when a lot of the story kind of really ties it together. Anyway, put that aside for now. As everyone knows at this point, I'm a huge Joe Abercrombie fan. I think his standalone books might even be better than the original First Law trilogy, which is saying something because that first trilogy is phenomenal. As always, Abercrombie's character work, phenomenal. Abercrombie's humor, if you have that type of sense of humor, which apparently I do, is great. A lot of people like Abercrombie for the darkness and the grittiness. Okay, I think that it's just good writing. I don't think Abercrombie is particularly darker or grittier, especially not for any kind of gratuitous reasons than any other modern fantasy writer out there. I think he deals with darker themes, and as a result, the writing needs to be a little bit darker. And I think that's completely okay. The Heroes is, I think, one of those books where you kind of see an author start to evolve. So The Heroes is a story that really takes place over 3 days, and it shows kind of how a specific battle or series of battles in a war unfolds, and you follow different characters who are participating in this battle on both sides of the conflict. And it is so different from the other stuff that Abercrombie has written from a narrative structure perspective, but still retains that great sort of human character-driven focus that he always has had. And so to me, The Heroes is really kind of an evolution to Abercrombie's writing. Much like, to me, Best Served Cold was also a big evolution in Abercrombie's writing, because compared to the original First Law trilogy, I felt like there was a lot more plot and story involved in Best Served Cold, a lot more narrative arcs. And then in The Heroes, you kind of have this sort of interesting device that's being used. And you also see Abercrombie playing with a few other literary techniques or narrative devices. For example, there's one battle sequence where the perspective of the story is being switched depending on... the perspective switches every time a character kills or is killed by another character. The way that's done is just done so beautifully that it is really, really interesting to see and to read. And I think it's just a demonstration of Abercrombie getting better and better and better. And given that I think he is already probably the best, maybe second best writer in the fantasy genre today, I think that's saying something. So again, at this point, everyone knows my biases, but if you have not read Abercrombie's standalone First Law books, you've only read the original trilogy, go pick up the standalones, because like I said, arguably, I think a case could be made that the standalones are even better than the original trilogy. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read this past fall, my thoughts on each of them. Hopefully there was something in there that was interesting to you. You learned something. There's something that you're going to pick up and that you're going to read. And now the next thing that I need to work on is going back through everything that I read this year and picking my favorite books of 2023. And it is going to be a tough choice, but that is the next thing I am going to be looking to do. So I hope you stick around, subscribe to the channel to see that video. Should be coming up shortly. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, enjoy the reading, and at this point, enjoy your holidays. Cheers.